So what was the U.S. objective over there while you were there, and do you believe that we accomplished that objective?
When you say over there, what do you mean? So my last deployment was in Haiti, so that was a completely different mission altogether. We went there right after the earthquake.
So not Haiti, then. So over in the Middle East.
From the Middle East.
Yeah.
So you asked me what was the objective over there, and did we accomplish it?
Yes.
Well, so here's the trouble with the global war on terror, right, is that it really kicked off as a result of 9/11 in 2001. And initially, the global war on terror started out in Afghanistan. And the mission there was very different than the mission that came out of 2003 and the invasion in Iraq. So you kind of got two very different things initially, two very different objectives and kind of two perspectives on whether we accomplished that. And then from there, the GWI, the Global War on Terror, kind of ballooned out into this larger, kind of global initiative to stop and hinder and reduce terrorist activities and prevent them from reaching American soil before it happened in a lot of other countries. So it started looking at places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Africa, places like Pakistan, and places that we really didn't have our hands in previously. So in terms of Iraq, where I was at a couple different times, initially the mission was to remove Saddam Hussein from power and kind of hand the power back over to the Iraqi people. And I would say the initial objective there of removing Hussein and his regime from power was clearly successful. But that changed very quickly. Within roughly about 7 months to a year, the objective became providing stability for the elections. And as that kind of continued to snowball, it became, denying Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates, essentially safe haven, the ability to be able to, do their activities outside of Afghanistan now and do them in places like Iraq. And so we were trying to prevent that from happening while enabling the Iraqi government to stand up and kind of build its own strength and have elections, and free elections. And then over time, that mission morphed into providing stability to the Iraqi police and the Iraqi security forces. And so, if you think about, the original mission of going in and kind of removing Hussein and his entire army and security forces from power, at some point, someone had to stand that back up. And that, essentially was our objective, towards the latter end of my second deployment, was essentially just taking a step back from actually doing combat missions and trying to hand that over to the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army. And so towards the end of the U.S. involvement in Iraq, it became much more of a kind of putting them in the driver's seat, so to speak. And so if you think of riding in the car with someone else, it's sort of like taking driver's ed. So, if you're learning how to drive, then your driving instructor is going to be in the passenger seat, so he's in the right seat. So we call it left seat, right seat. And so initially, we were the instructors, and we were in the driver's seat. We were showing them how we do things, them being the police and the Iraqi army. And then over time, it became putting them in the driver's seat while we were in the passenger seat and kind of providing guidance to them. And then towards the end, it was we're riding in a totally different vehicle, but, kind of restricting them from being able to do everything because they're not capable of doing very basic things. And then, at the very, very end, it was, okay, here, you guys go out on your own and fly the coop and show us what you got. And then you leave, and it's on them. And I would say to a certain extent, we were successful, but in a lot of ways, we didn't really set the conditions for success in the long term, which is why we're in the situation we're in right now.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I like that analogy.
Okay. Are you, voice recording this or trying to take notes? Because I'm talking very fast, I know.
Voice recording.
Okay, good. All
yeah,
right.
there's no way I could write that fast.
Right, that's what I figured, yeah. I figured I'd give you the, big picture, and then you can kind of ask me questions from there, and I can explain things that don't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done many an interview in my day, so I'm kind of
in your day, huh?
yes. I've probably done. This is number 4, I think, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, lot of projects like this, interestingly.
So, and then just kind of really quickly, the issue in Afghanistan was initially it was just essentially to, when we were, when the planes hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and crashed in Pennsylvania, the Taliban had taken over years before in Afghanistan, and so they essentially kicked out what was the previous regime there, and they ran the country. And over time, in the late 90s and into 2000, they started allowing Osama bin Laden and this group that we now know as Al-Qaeda to kind of gain a foothold there. And they provided them a safe haven, while other countries like the United States were kind of really upset about that. And so we, in a number of ways, we tried to sanction them. We tried to, coerce them into, allowing us access to be able to strike Al-Qaeda and their targets. But the Taliban, in a lot of ways had some similar ideologies, and they had a really strong relationship with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and so they wouldn't allow us access to be able to go in and kind of remove them from the country. And there's a lot of kind of strategic interests in that, and some of it is access to oil pipelines that put oil into Europe and places like Western Russia, and Afghanistan provides a means to potentially provide a pipeline that goes across their country. And so there's a lot of strategic interests in Afghanistan outside of just the United States. And so then when they attack us in 2001, our initial objective is essentially just to go in and destroy Al-Qaeda and their ability to be able to attack the United States and other countries abroad.
And that was with OEF, right?
And so that was the beginning of the global war on terror, and that's what became Operation Enduring Freedom in the OEF. And so initially it was Central Intelligence Agency, small units, and Special Forces units that went in and, kind of under the cover and were doing essentially strikes on Al-Qaeda targets and then Taliban targets. And over time, very quickly we were, we removed the Taliban from power, and we started to provide the opportunity for Afghanistan as a country to set up its own centralized government. And again, initiate free elections, provide the ability to be able to, provide security for those elections. And then it morphed into a larger picture because the Taliban started to try to reclaim the territory that they had previously, and it became an insurgency. And that's what essentially developed into the issue that we have today, which is for the long, for many, many years, because we were focused on Iraq, we didn't have, a significant footprint in Afghanistan. And as we switched from Iraq in 2008, 2009 back into Afghanistan, the Taliban had really gained a stronghold in a lot of different areas, but particularly in southern and western Afghanistan. And so the idea then was to remove the Taliban from those areas and provide the ability for those local governments, the equivalents of states, but in Afghanistan they call them provinces and districts, to allow those provinces and district governments to stand up and to be able to govern and then provide essential goods and services and security. And then, again, create a police force, create an army that can then, defend and secure itself internally. And then do the left seat, right seat analogy and then back off. And so I would say initially we were successful in removing Al-Qaeda and the Taliban from government, but over the long term, we've had short-term gains and some, kind of intermediate gains that have been really successful in the country. But overall, our mission has changed very, very significantly from what it was in 2001 to what it is today.
Yeah. I was reading.
Probably really complicated, but
no. I've gotten a lot of the background information on it. But
okay.
it's super interesting. So I kind of have a basis of knowledge, but hearing about the specifics of it is super interesting, and I love this type of stuff. So I'd be happy to listen to you talk all day.
So I'll note down on one more thing, and then you can kind of move on from there.
Do your thing.
So I think the last piece of that is we talked about, Afghanistan, which was the beginning of GWAT, to Iraq, which was kind of the second phase of GWAT in a sense, to, kind of what has been an ongoing mission since, really 2001. And that is kind of everywhere outside of Iraq and Afghanistan. And, initially it was denied. We were focused very significantly and primarily on Al-Qaeda as kind of the big elephant in the room that we were trying to prevent and destabilize and essentially kind of cut off the snake at the head, right?
Yeah.
And they eventually started to have these other kind of malign groups, criminal elements, and insurgent groups in different countries in places like the Middle East and Africa that started kind of taking on their name. And so they would just call themselves like Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb or Al-Qaeda in Somalia or in different countries and stuff. And so we call those affiliates. And so then it became an effort to, gather information, gather intelligence, effect strikes, put folks on the ground in places like sub-Saharan Africa to deny Al-Qaeda's affiliates the ability to be able to do, attacks in those countries and abroad as well. And so the ongoing effort for the global war on terror has kind of expanded outside of Iraq and Afghanistan, and even with the development of ISIS back in Iraq, has expanded into countries like Syria. And so you kind of see all of these different affiliates with very similar goals, sometimes different goals, but all kind of directed towards, larger issues like establishing a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate, which is like a big state, or like kind of the idea of movement of Islam, government or governed by Islam, as well as kind of destabilizing the West and the West's influence in Islam nation. So there you go.
Yeah, and the caliphate's the main goal of ISIS presently, correct?
So I would say, I think probably the best way to word that is ISIS's main goal is to establish, an Islamic caliphate. And they have, and even within ISIS, there are subgroups within ISIS. And that's part of the issue that you see in Syria now, is that there's not one main hub. There are a number of different groups that some of them are more focused on opposing the Syrian regime and kind of achieving local interests. And some of them are more radicalized and more focused on global initiatives and global issues, sort of in the way that Al-Qaeda was. And so they take on the name ISIS. And so you're starting to see the same thing that happened with Al-Qaeda, 2002, 2003, where all of these groups around the world started taking on this term ISIS or Al-Qaeda and kind of rebranding themselves as that in places like Mogadishu and Somalia and Africa, places like Libya as well.
It's just a mess over there.
It's a mess.
So what was your grasp of the conflict before you went over to Iraq in 2003?
So you have to think about like the time frame. So when I graduated college, 2000. So I was in college when September 11th occurred. I was a sophomore, and then I saw the invasion happen my junior year when I was in college as well. And so going into my senior year, our objectives were still very much focused on removing Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, removing the Taliban, and finding Osama bin Laden, which we hadn't yet, and then removing Saddam Hussein and the Hussein regime from power in Iraq. And so by the time that I'd gotten into the Marine Corps and was getting ready to deploy, the conflict in Afghanistan was kind of on the back burner, and Iraq was really the main focus. And that's because it started to turn into this counterinsurgency fight where you've got all of these local groups, and some of them are, affiliated with Sunni beliefs, some of them are Shia beliefs, some of them are really just criminal elements and criminal gangs that kind of band together, and then some of them are radicalized, like terrorist functions that are coming in from different areas, like Afghanistan, like Syria, and have been radicalized through fighting conflicts in places like Russia and Crimea in the late 2000s and late 90s and early 2000s. And so essentially what I understood was that, we had gone from, moving through a country, clearing out a regime that was kind of, not really, at the time, we thought that, Saddam Hussein was kind of, the bad guy. and then it kind of turned and morphed into an insurgency fight that wasn't all that much different from Vietnam.
Yeah, I remember reading about the counterinsurgency techniques and how they were sort of similar to the ones that we used in Vietnam.
Yeah, so the Marine Corps really kind of bit off on that. We had some initial success with some counterinsurgency tactics that we used in Vietnam. And in 2005, we were still kind of feeling our way through how to fight the fight. And essentially, we found in the same way we did in Vietnam that counterinsurgency, the heart of the counterinsurgency is the people, and getting the people, on your side and protecting the people and allowing the people to stand up and defend themselves is usually the most successful. And so we took our lead from a program called the Combined Action Program in Vietnam. We called it CAP. That was really successful, and it took smaller units and it partnered them with villages where they essentially lived in the villages for the entire deployment and kind of did a policing model. And that's exactly what we started doing in Western Iraq in 2005. We had, infantry platoons, infantry companies living in cities and villages, partnering with the locals, kind of creating these local police forces and giving them the confidence to stand up for their own security, and then doing that left seat, right seat through the course of, other deployments as other units kind of rotated in and out. While at the same time, taking on larger, more direct combat missions to remove, like radicalized elements of these insurgent groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq and stuff. So, say right before I got into Iraq, we just fought the Battle of Fallujah, and that essentially was one of those larger battles where, that city had become overrun with, the more radicalized factions of these insurgent groups, and in order to get Marines into the city to be able to partner with the locals, we had to clear it out, and that's kind of what Fallujah was. It was an effort to clear Al-Qaeda in Iraq out of the city of Fallujah, and then put in these kind of combined action programs in this area and start to provide essential goods and services, everything from food and water to lights and electricity again, to providing folks the ability to be able to sell goods in the bazaar, to fixing issues with the sewers that had backed up and had been broken and weren't running for since 2003, 2002 time. So
yeah, so killed that. So my next question is, what would a typical day in your life look while you were in Iraq?
So it was different for both deployments. So on my first deployment, I was an intelligence officer. So it could be anything from reading message traffic and providing briefs to the commander, so going out on patrols and locating and finding and disabling IEDs, to meeting with locals and trying to gather information, and doing, questioning and interviewing prisoners or detainees. So kind of the gamut, but long days, whether you're back in the rear or whether you're out in the field, rolling around in trucks and stuff in the desert. Usually get like 3 or 4 hours of sleep on average, over the course of about 7 months. And you don't take any days off. It's 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So
That's
kind of what a typical deployment looks like. When I was on ship, and in Haiti, it was very, very different. When you're on ship as a Marine, you're kind of locked down to a room that you share that has bunk beds in it with other officers or other enlisted folks. And if you're floating around and there's not a whole lot going on, you're doing training on the ship. And so because I was in a special operations unit called reconnaissance platoons, we would do shooting on the ship, we would do fast roping or parachuting or diving, and then from time to time throughout the 7-month deployment, we would stop in various countries and do port stops and get out and kind of treat it like a 2 or 3 day vacation, and then also do like training exercises. So for example, when we stopped in Greece, we spent 3 days on platoon did jumping with the Greek or Hellenic special forces.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and then when we were in Iraq, we were diving off the coast down in Kuwait. So, yeah.
That's pretty cool. So, and not cool at the same time. Probably, it sounded super exhausting.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
So what was your longest deployment?
So I did about 8.5, 9 months in Iraq on my second term, and then my last two deployments, essentially they're broken up into two. We went out in ships, we floated around for about 7 months, and we did mostly training and port stops, and then we came back, and I was getting ready to rotate up to Quantico, and the earthquake in Haiti hit, and so we got back on the ships and went down to Haiti for 4 months. And we were essentially doing humanitarian aid and assistance down there. So everything from, initially, once we got on the ground, we were some of the first guys on the ground there. So I was taking helicopters out with my platoon to villages that no one could get to because the bridges had been destroyed.
Oh, wow.
And kind of figuring out, what the issues were there, what the needs were, and then flying medical teams out to do some medical assistance to the villagers there, and then flying people back that were in pretty serious condition to the Red Cross's ship, the USS Comfort, and then we started bringing in food and water, and then it was essentially just kind of patrolling around, preventing local thugs from causing issues, while the security services were focused on providing security in the larger cities like Port-au-Prince.
That's super interesting. What would you say was your most memorable moment while you were in Iraq? Or top memorable moments?
Top memorable moment. I think on every deployment, like in combat, there are good days and bad days. And I think probably the most memorable moments are when you are able to overcome those bad days with the guys around you. When you're able to see your Marines kind of grow over the course of 7 months. And there were times where my Marines on their own would decide that it was important to provide the local nationals with some type of support that wasn't necessarily part of the mission. And so one of the things that we did was one of the routes that we had to patrol pretty regularly for IEDs in between one of the major cities up in the border with Syria was about 75 kilometers long, and we would spend about half the day walking most of that route by foot and trying to find IEDs so convoys behind us would get hit. And we would always pass these local Bedouins that lived in tents and essentially walked their sheep in the middle of the desert. And they always had these kids out there that looked like, they were pretty impoverished. And, they were always wearing the same clothes, and their shoes were kind of ragged. And so when we got back to base, me and my guys went around and we found bundles of brand new clothes and stuff that weren't being used, and stuff that was being given away, and shoes and toys. And we loaded up the trucks, and the next time we went out, we kind of stopped and spent a good amount of time with those guys and took some pictures, handed some stuff out. And, I think while that makes you feel good, I think in the larger piece, when you ask about did we accomplish our mission, I think part of the mission is not only just, finding the enemy and removing their ability to be able to affect the local population. It's also building relationships and providing and setting a good example for the next generation. And things like that build confidence in our country that we're not just there to destroy things. We're not there to take the oil. We're there to be fellow man. And I think those are kind of probably the most memorable moments of the deployment.
That's amazing. The whole year, my teacher would always talk, whenever we talked about any conflict, he would talk about winning the hearts and minds of the people. So
Yep.
That's definitely something that stuck with me, and that really relates to that. That's super cool. It was cool that you were able to do that, too, in such a sort of desolate place.
Yeah, I'll say, one of the things about, being in the military, you probably heard this from other people, but, you grow up very quickly. And I think when you're in the military and you're in combat, you you grow up, twice as fast, sometimes 3 times as fast because you have to, and especially as an officer, like, Papa was an officer, he went to the Naval Academy and he spent 30 years as a naval officer. But when you're young, you come out of college and you're 22 years old, 23 years old as a platoon commander or a young officer, you're given responsibility, not over, a lot and, very, a lot of gear that's very, very expensive, but also people who are invaluable. And you're responsible for not only their lives and making decisions that affect their lives in combat, but also for things back home, like their relationships with their family and their ability to be able to spend time with their wives, and providing them kind of moral guidance when they're kind of steering the wrong way and being that moral compass. And so at the age of 22, you're asked to grow up very, very quickly and be responsible for a lot more than yourself and look out for other people more than you would yourself. So, yeah, hearts and minds.
Wow. That's super cool. And I don't think, like, so many times that, like, those aren't the things that were taught in a classroom, but those are probably the most important things that you guys are doing over there. So that's super cool.
You got it. It's all about those relationships.
Yeah. So next question is, were you able to stay in touch with your family, and what methods did you use to stay in touch with your family, if so?
Yeah, very different, huh? From what you were talking to folks from Vietnam and World War II. The answer is yeah. I mean, just like in those conflicts, you're able to stay in touch with your family, but the volume of it depends on the technology that's available, where you're at, what type of environment you're in at that time. So all 4 deployments were all very different in terms of my ability to be able to stay in contact. My first deployment, I had intermittent contact. Phone calls were pretty difficult, but I had a satellite phone that I was responsible for, so I was able to make phone calls from time to time. We still did letter mail, but that I think was functionally just a decision for my family who wanted to write.
Yeah.
Because I had access to a computer from time to time, so they could easily send emails. But people send packages. You get letter mail from time to time, and then a lot of email. So that was my first deployment, but probably a lot less than my second deployment. By the time I got on my second deployment, we had been in country the Marine Corps had been in country for quite a while, so we had a pretty good network established. So email was primary means of communication then. And then my third and fourth deployments, I was mostly based on a ship. So phone calls off of a ship are pretty difficult to make because there's just a lot of people and not a lot of phones. And you're not making cell phone calls unless you hit shore and go to a port. And again, email access is pretty restricted because you're always worried about providing the location to the enemy and stuff. So emails from time to time, phone calls when I could when we would land in a place like Rhoda, Spain, or in Italy or Jordan or something, and I could make a cell phone call. But your family, most of the time they get used to it, and you kind of find a rhythm of staying in touch and not being distracted by trying to contact people back home as well.
Okay, cool. Okay, so next question is, what was it like returning home from each of your deployments?
Yeah, again, very different. So by the time I got back to Haiti, I was kind of an old hand at that point, and it was super simple. Always great to return home, but I think the first time was certainly the most memorable. But I always kind of made a habit of not really telling anybody that I was coming back.
Oh,
they knew
fun!
That I would be back. Yeah, they knew that I would be back, like kind of in a certain window, but I didn't want to make it like a big deal. You met my mom; she's pretty reserved. So
yeah.
The first time, I didn't tell her until the very last minute, until I'd actually landed. And so she hopped in a car and drove all the way down. But when I got off, so it's for us coming back from Iraq, we were coming back on planes and landing, in the States and getting on a bus, and they'd drive us back to the barracks and drop us off. So the units would have these kind of giant homecomings. And, some people have folks there, families and girlfriends and wives. And so most of the time I did. But that was very intentional just because, again, I was in charge and I wanted those guys to focus on them and make sure that they were set up when they got home. And then, I could kind of go off and recuperate.
Yeah.
So the first time was pretty memorable. I had roommates that I lived with, and we were all deployed to Iraq at the same time.
Oh,
So I
wow.
got back about 3 or 4 weeks before everybody, so I was kind of by myself for a few weeks, which was a little lonely. And then the second time I got back around the same time as one of my roommates who was also in Iraq, and so that was pretty neat. And then I drove up to Richmond, spent time with the family, and then the last 2 deployments, I was a platoon commander, so I was more worried about making sure my guys were squared away and that the gear got off the ship and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
And I was talking to the Vietnam vet, and obviously their homecoming was a little bit different, but
Yeah.
when you stepped off the ship in your uniform or the airplane, but you were received pretty well by the general public, would you say?
Well, so the way they do homecomings now is it's not really open to the general public. Like, you kind of come back on a military base.
Oh, okay.
And so, it's families really, and families and friends and people from your unit that may not have deployed that are there waiting for you. So, in that sense, it's very controlled. And so, the reception is pretty good. And again, it was one of those things that, we were kind of in the wake of September 11th, and there was a lot of support, for each one of my deployments for coming back.
Yeah.
Banners and, people being really, really happy and supportive and stuff. So, yeah, I would say it was very, very different than the guys coming back from Vietnam. A lot of appreciation since that time frame. It's really unfortunate that those guys had to come back to.
Yeah, I agree.
And really embarrassing. So.
So did you work at all with women over there, or was it sort of separated?
Well, so most of the combat units, the infantry units, are pretty segregated because in the Marine Corps and in most services, the infantry units, women aren't allowed to occupy infantry unit positions. So I would say that mostly it was segregated, but there are women in and around. When I was on ship, the Navy and the Marine Corps, you're kind of in one big space, and so you have like non-combat units and non-combat positions and stuff. So there are women in and around your spaces. So you work a lot more with women in those situations than you do when you're in Iraq in an infantry unit.
Okay. And what do you believe the United States' role in the world should be today?
Can you ask that one again?
What do you believe the United States' role in the world should be today? Like foreign policy-wise.
So what do I think the United States' role in the Middle East should be? Is that right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out where we're going to get gas next.
Don't worry about it.
That's a really good question. I think there's a lot of politics involved in a question like that. I think fundamentally, I think it's important for us to maintain a relationship with our counterparts in the Middle East and elsewhere outside of the Middle East, because ultimately the Middle East and what determines what is happening in those countries isn't single-handedly determined by the countries that occupy the Middle East. It's also determined by larger countries outside of that have strategic interests in there. So kind of when I was talking about oil pipelines, crossing countries like Afghanistan, countries like Russia, Great Britain, China, they have a lot of strategic interests, in the Middle East. And some of it is resources, and, oil, which is kind of obvious. And some of it is just simply, providing a counterbalance to other countries that they're not aligned with. So ultimately, I think it's really important for us to maintain relationships in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Jordan and Syria, but the nature of those relationships all differ significantly based on the regimes and what their goals are long term. So I think that's kind of a big brushstroke answer. It probably doesn't really get down to what you're trying to ask me, but
No, that's perfect.
okay.
Well, I think that's all the questions that I have for you today.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That means so much to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, if you have other questions, just don't hesitate to give me a call or shoot me a text.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Have fun on
Bye
your
now.
drive back to San Diego. Say hello to your wonderful wife for me.
I'll certainly do that. Thanks.
All right. See ya.